Hi, everyone. Good morning. So I'm going to try to break some bad behavior and stay behind the podium and behind the mic. I have a speech. I'm going to see how far I get on that. There's so many folks out here that I know and have had some fairly lengthy conversations with. I'm uncomfortable reading to you. So what I was told is take about 10 minutes to talk about some issues and then have a discussion. I would like to start, though, as a certified acquisition professional. When I heard that this facility was available for lease, what I'm trying to do now is negotiate in exchange for my speaking. We get to use this facility free. So negotiations will commence now. So in all seriousness, I'd like to start by talking about our responsibility to ensure that every soldier that we deploy is equipped to achieve decisive overmatch, regardless of the mission. And I think in the discussions that we've had, there has been this, I want to call it not necessarily confusion, but some questions about when the chief states that readiness is our number one priority. Because I think in the past, we have communicated to you any number of priorities. The network is our priority, cyber is our priority, all kinds of different things. I think there is a real simple elegance in what the chief has said in terms of readiness being the number one priority and that there is no other. Because my belief is that statement in itself talks to this notion about it doesn't matter let me be careful, whatever the number of our force, it has to be ready, it has to be equipped, and it has to be trained to execute whatever missions they're called on to do. And so I think the vision, I think this notion of readiness is number one is really important. What's required of us is to make sure that we unpack, that we understand all of those pieces of readiness to include capability and capacity. I think it's critical that we start there. And that vision, I think, is helping us as an Army to position ourselves for the future. So on the material development side, so our responsibility is to provide and empower and unburden and protect our soldiers in an environment that has a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of complexity. And quite frankly, I take umbrage when people kind of downplay the complexity associated with what we do. We operate in some very difficult environments, far away from sometimes our logistics footprint, and we do that all over this world. Today, at any given time, we probably have about 187,000 of our soldiers forward deployed or in an operation. That's a significant number of soldiers to make sure are equipped, trained, and organized to support our commanders. We don't have the luxury of choosing our missions or preparing to fight only one type of enemy at one time and at one place. We must be prepared to fight across the full spectrum of threats. And I'd argue that because of our adversaries, state and non-state actors, they are continuing to invest in technologies, unburdened in many cases by some of the processes, laws, and responsibilities that we have in terms of getting those capabilities to our soldiers. And sometimes that activity, although well-meaning, creates a lag, if you will, in the system and our ability to timely get that capability to our soldiers. And so at the end of this, I'm going to pose a number of questions to you, our industry-based partners, the folks who care about how our Army positions itself, to figure out how can we do these things smarter. We have to make smart investment decisions for our future. But they not only have to be smart, but they have to be timely also. There are great choices out there, but we don't have the luxury of waiting 4, 8, 12 years to implement and bring that capability to our force. Another area that I would hope that we would talk about at the end of this is the notion of interoperability and how we deal with our coalition partners. I think we are starting, I am seeing this, I've been in this position a couple of years, I'm starting to see us really look at how do we baseline our set of capabilities, understand what that provides us in terms of capability and capacity, and then based on that, take a look at our investment decisions. And we'll talk about that in a second, but let me talk about that baselining process. Fairly straightforward. Define the capability that you have and that you need. Make sure that we establish an architecture that's understood by the people who provide capabilities. What we cannot afford to do, what we cannot afford to continue to do, is have a bunch of one-off systems that create integration challenges, not only within the Army, but with our joint force partners, and I would add, with our coalition partners, with whom we will always fight. And so understanding that baseline capability and understanding the architecture makes the difference. Based on that baseline, how do you allocate the appropriate resources? And then, again, and there's a theme here, how do you field that quickly to our force? There are great technologies out there, there are great capabilities out there, that we have a process that we start our discussions with. If we do this right, we'll see this in the field 6 years from now. That's insane. Our speed to market has to change. Our ability to get into soldiers' hands quickly has to change. So when I talk about baseline, let me give you an example. I think the Joint Battle Command Platform, JBCP, which provides situational awareness, many folks call it Blue Force tracking, is integrated on more than 120,000 platforms in the Army. 120,000 platforms. Each one of our combat brigades have that capability. It's standard. And what we've done is from that original baseline, because we understood the architecture, because we understand how it's deployed and used, we've had the ability to incrementally improve that to include now adding some cyber protection capability, speedier transmission times, and we have a logistics base to support it. You have to have all of those things. Neat one-off ideas are kind of cool, but you've got to talk about how does that fit into our baseline. I talked about interoperability. Again, interoperability is not only important to us. So oftentimes the discussions center about the interoperability between this formation within the Army and another. Interoperability has to be considered in terms of not only internal to the Army, but also with our Air Force, our Navy partners, and then again on the coalition side. We spend a lot of time on our investments and in our acquisition strategies in understanding the international implications associated with that particular piece of hardware or software. And look, as much as anyone here, I also understand that as we went into sequestration, as our budget profile changed, many of our industry partners have leveraged our foreign military sales, your direct sales, to help reduce the overhead cost and our lack of investment in some cases to keep our development actions going. We understand that, and we understand the challenges associated with licensing. We understand the challenges associated with technology transfer, and what I would implore you, what I would ask you to do, is that you have to continue that engagement, and you have to continue to engage with us early on in the process as we go through design, as we understand those technologies, so that we have the ability to help influence, so that you don't come to the end of it and then realize that it's a systems capability that we cannot provide to our coalition partners. Early in the process, it's the only way to do this right. I talked about the fact that interoperability is critical, and it's a critical part of our acquisition strategy, and we have to, General Swan made the comment that we were in the UK a couple of weeks ago, I spent my time talking about very specific systems that our partners want to procure, that they want to not only procure, but they want to make sure that they are interoperable. And I know this sounds like a small thing, but so for some reason they drive on the wrong side of the road. I have no idea why they do that. But even at that level, we have a discussion about in our design if it's going to be a left or right-hand drive. It goes down to that level. So why wait until the end? We have to have those engagements early on. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about the rest of the exportability. Those of you who are in this business understand that. But I do want to talk again, and many of you, as I've stated, we've talked about this before, but I want to remind you of our investment strategy, of the approach that we are taking within the Army and how we're doing modernization. And it starts again, and I saw General Perna at one of the tables, it starts again that if we're going to modernize, we have to start with understanding those things we're not going to keep, because it is costing us money. And so I know it seems counterintuitive, but the start of our modernization strategy starts with divestiture. And there shouldn't be this notion of protectionism of existing systems. What there has to be is this notion of what is the capability that we need to provide our soldiers, and does it represent the best capability we can provide with the dollars that are available? And oftentimes, even though it's something, I'm an air defense officer. I think I lived with interim systems the whole time I was in a unit. Some of those systems had to go away to make room for more capable systems. And as an Army, we have to make hard decisions about what those are. I said in a meeting the other day, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I found the discussion to be fairly interesting when we talked about programs of record. What I find with my industry partners is that if you're a program of record, it's about how do you protect that program of record. And if you're not a program of record, it's how can you disrupt it. And that we are too committed, we are too linked to our programs. There are reasons. Some are from a budgeting standpoint, some is from a predictability, some is a standardization. But we, together, have to figure our way through what is the best way for us to provide a capability, but create opportunities to continue to improve upon that capability up to the point where you realize it has to be displaced with the next best system. And there are examples of that. Take a look at the 113, right? We've had 113s in our force since before I was born. That's crazy. Those have to be replaced. I know you're trying to do the math right now, but just accept it. So I'd like to pose just a couple of questions for you, and then I'll stop talking because I want to have the discussion. If you accept the fact that we start with divestiture, then we have to spend the next look at, we've decided those things that we're going to keep. How do we make sure that they are ready for combat, that they are ready for the next fight? And after you get past that, we have to do a couple of things. So we have systems that are in great shape, but because of new challenges from threats, or because certain components are near end of life, you have to do modernization. I would argue that our industrial base is probably the best in the world at making our systems better. So when I came in the Army, Black Hawk, Abrams, Bradley, Patriot, all systems that you would argue came in the 80s. Technology was from the 70s, but gave us tremendous, tremendous capability. I would challenge any of you to go out to a flight line today and look at an Apache or a Chinook or a Black Hawk and tell me it's the same aircraft. It looks the same, but the internal components are all different and all better. The same thing applies to the Bradley. The same thing applies to the Abrams. We are very good at that. And that allows us to do this modernization piece that upgrades the technology to either extend its life or to deal with a new threat to that platform. And then the next piece for us, and this is really where we spend a lot of time, is that as you've gone through those first three tiers, you then make decisions about which things you have to buy new. Again, based on the threat or based on the fact that you've hit end of life on an existing system. And you make those decisions to bring those capabilities in. And you've seen it. JLTV is a great example. And the AMPV are great examples where we realized that we could not continue with the 113 series of vehicles, or as good as MRAP is, and as much value that MRAP brought to our force in this fight, that we needed to find another vehicle to start looking at how do I assess my light tactical vehicle fleet, Humvees and MRAPs, and bring in a capability like the JLTV. Those were very conscious decisions for us to buy new. There will be others, but again, you've got to go through those first three layers before you do that. And then finally, we had a brief conversation out in the hall about protecting the S&T investment. I would argue that the same decisions that you make as a business to understand how you position yourself for the future is the same decision, the same process that we go through as an Army that says, what am I investing in technologies in order to not only counter, and this is a real issue for me. It is not just about countering someone else's threat. This is about us being able to provide a capability that causes our potential enemies to react. And so that S&T investment, that science and technology investment, is critical for us to position ourselves for the future, not only to deal with a known threat or a potential threat, but also to get within the enemy's decision cycle, make them react to us. I make this argument now all of the time. When I came in the Army, I remember this phrase about us owning the night. And I watched our Army. I watched our Army not only leverage and develop technologies that gave us the capability to see better than our enemy, but we trained for that environment. We did all of those things, not just the material side, for us to own that space. My argument is that we have to do the same thing. We have to invest in technologies that give us a decisive advantage, that give us a competitive advantage over our enemies. I don't want to spend our time just reacting to the latest cyber threat or the latest chemical threat. We have to do that because we have to protect our soldiers. But what we have to do is own the environment. We have to be able to make decisions about where we're going to invest so that we cause people to react. I told you I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So here's where I think we need some help. And I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago, actually middle of June, to go out and sit down, spend 30-minute sessions with our industry partners, some very large, some very small. And I would tell you that I think the biggest complaint, and I'm not going to say they were complaining, the biggest observation, my biggest takeaway was this notion of interaction with our leaders and understanding where the Army is going and how they could help. And I think we have become so sequential in how we do business. We have an idea of something that we want, a capability we need. It gets published in an RFI and a request for information. It goes out, you play with it for a while, you come back, and we have this exchange, but it's very sequential and it's very time-consuming. How do we as an enterprise, how do we as an Army, how do we as a nation work our way through that we reduce that cycle time and have the opportunity to have those kinds of interactions? This notion of creating a competitive advantage, this notion of how do we reduce cycle time, speed to market, is something that has to be addressed. The access to technologies today by our enemies has changed the equation. If you go out to the Computer Electronics Show, as an example, and you see the technologies that you can just buy, you no longer have to be a powerful nation state with a great pocketbook, a great set of resources to buy your own Air Force, to buy the communication systems, encrypted communication systems. People have access to that technology now. If I take 6 to 8 years to come up with a good idea and then put it in the field, we are already 2 generations behind. And that is unsustainable. So my question to you is, how do we change that dynamic? And how do we change that dynamic in an environment where Congress still has its authorities and responsibilities? We have our responsibilities to our taxpayers, and we want to make sure that everything is fair, but we have to change that dynamic. And look, you have a responsibility to shareholders. We have a responsibility to our soldiers. Let's understand the environment, and then let's work our way through it. All right, I'll stop talking. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, AUSA, for the invitation.
Anyone?
Wow, I'm out of here.
Sir, I'll just stand up.
Yeah.
Ray DuBois, CSIS. The NDAA 16, the service chiefs were sort of reinserted into the RDNA process formally. In the NDAA 17, there are some subsequent possible changes. The chief has testified, as I understand, to and has requested or redefined those responsibilities that he would like to have in terms of research, development, and acquisition with some specificity. How does that implicate the Army's decision process in this regard and the balance between the civilian leadership and the military leadership? From your point of view?
It's a great question, and I think we've been seeing some of the benefits, if you will, from the 16 legislation. So let me start by, so my position has never changed. I think less legislation is better than any. And the reason for that is it becomes cumulative. Every good idea to fix things comes with some level of overhead, if you will. And the reason I tell you that is I believe that a number of those areas, I think the chief already has authorities for. It's about exercising them. But there's some language in there that I think has really helped us in terms of how we get through this process. And I think we're seeing it today. An example that I would give you is so the chief personally hosts a review of requirements. And this is really where I believe the uniformed leadership of the Army has a tremendous amount of influence, and that is in the definition of the requirement up front. So in many cases, I think we have, because we were an Army that was engaged, right, decisively engaged in 2 theaters, in two areas, for 15 years. And so in some cases, I think we let the process run without the benefit of the uniformed leadership. And I think having the chief sit at the table, and not just the chief, I might add, but with the senior commanders within this Army, making decisions about, is this the right thing we need at the right time? And if you take our limited set of resources, right, if you take the limited set of resources we have, is this the most important thing that we can do? Getting that direction, that guidance from the chief and his senior commanders makes the difference, because now it gets you the ability to align resources, the acquisition process, all of those things become aligned. And in that acquisition process, I would add the test community. All of those things now become focused in terms of what our objective state is. And I think having that add has become very beneficial. I would just reiterate this point about be careful, right? I love Congress. Congress has demonstrated over the last 15 years an unwavering support to our soldiers. When you look at OCO, when you look at the support they have provided to us, There is no question about their commitment to taking care of soldiers. It is in their interest. They are saying these things to help get this process and make this acquisition process more streamlined. I've had a number of discussions with Mr. Thornberry about all of the hurdles, if you will, in the acquisition process. And I think he's taken a very measured approach to how we can help. So I don't want this to be viewed as a criticism. My argument is that in some cases, I think the explicit and the implied authorities within the Chief of Staff, the Army leadership, I'm always concerned when we add legislation to that. And so there's a lot of positive here. I just want to be careful about how much we open the door.
So Tom Smedley from Esri Soldier Fly, thanks for coming. So I was up talking to a program manager at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and he said, listen, really, let's just be honest. If you're not on a team that has money and probably on the installation, it is very hard to get new ideas into the cycle that you talked about. Yeah. So even with the creation of the DIUX out in California, ARL West is coming out there. We've had some great industry days with C3T, Surdec, etc. But as a company that has constantly innovative technology, really about every 6 months, and we get it out to our commercial customers, how do we break that cycle if there are these teams that, if you're not on a team, you're sort of stuck on the outside? Maybe Army warfighting experiment will help, because everyone's on board. But I would just tell you, from my foxhole, from my cubicle, it's still pretty challenging.
It is, and I don't want anyone to walk away from here thinking that this is easy. But I would go back to this previous question about legislation. So one of the things that's in there is this notion of the ability to do rapid prototyping. I think that's going to be one of the vehicles that we're going to be able to use to bring capability in. My problem again is that from the notion of doing prototyping, you'll see no argument from me or from my community. I think it's an excellent vehicle for us to get access to small players, to new innovative companies, to bring things in that are outside of an established program of record. My issue is that notion alone is interesting without the funding to support us doing that. And the problem with that funding is that, again, this notion of fairness and accountability requires, so you have the opportunity to go look and see what's in our budget. In many cases, you're seeing these things in real time. There is this notion that setting $50 million, $25 million, $100 million, whatever that number is, aside, unencumbered with the notion of we want flexibility and the ability to be agile as new technology is presented. We want the ability to use those funds to go out and learn and do and bring, and perhaps even bring them in very quickly. And so the tension that we're going to find here is that there is the desire to have that capability, but it has to be matched with funding. And the argument that I make to people is that, look, the reason we have the environment we have is because of our risk profile. So this is all about risk and our risk tolerance. And so we like to talk about being agile, and we like to talk about being flexible. But I told you in the very beginning about this notion of programs of record. Programs of record are safe, right? So if you're looking out, you know that there's a program, here's the amount of funding that's against it, and here's what's going to be delivered. People get that. What becomes hard is, and you see it in Silicon Valley, you see it in some of our innovative areas today in pharmaceuticals, you see it in biotech, you see all of those things today, where people are willing to risk money for high reward as they bring in disruptive technologies, innovative technologies. But you have to be willing to take the risk. And if we want to have that speed to market, if we want to be an agile organization, we are going to have to change our risk profile. Now look, I'm not talking about rolling the dice, right? I'm talking about making informed decisions in technologies that are very important to us. And look at EW, electronic warfare, cyber protection, position navigation, technology, protection of our combat vehicles and our soldiers, lighter weight materials. Those are all things that we should be willing to invest in, and we should take some portion of our budget. And I don't know what that is, but we should take some portion of that budget and say, let's try to change the mold. Let's do something different. And you know what? Some of this may not play out. But the potential is for me to change the equation. So the burden that we have on a soldier in terms of weight to provide protection is significant. People yell at me for the weight of a tank. But the reason that we have the weight on the tank is because we are adding protection. And so when you look at things like electric armor, when you look at active protection systems, when you look at new composite materials using ceramics or other capabilities that are out there, you got to be willing to do two things. You have to be willing to invest in those capabilities. And then here's something that we often forget. You have to invest in the manufacturing capability to do that, which means you got to tool up, which costs money. It's a capital investment. And so it's okay, and I look, I'm on the other end of this a lot of times where people, you need to be more innovative and you need to be more fast. And what I want to say to them is change your risk profile. Open the aperture a little bit. And I'm not passionate about this at all. It's a great question.
General Courtney McBride, Inside the Army. Actually, two questions for you. If you could kind of outline for us the potential impact of a likely continuing resolution on your acquisition priorities. Are there key areas that could be delayed or that might necessitate a request for an anomaly? And secondly, if you could just give us an update on the Army's efforts to develop its rapid capability office. Okay.
So two good questions. So I'm going to give you a short answer to the first question. There will be an impact. So again, as you take a look at this acquisition process, so every year we do this, right? So we plan out 5 years. We get to the year of execution with an expectation of seeing money at a very particular time. We try to address our contract vehicles, and so that we have time for implementation. Here's what's very interesting, and I'm not a contracting guy, but I'm a person that relies on contracting as a product manager, a program manager, and then as a program executive officer. And the thing that drives me crazy is fourth quarter awards. I'm sure many of you have dealt with this. Is that for some reason, you look at the bulk of our execution, and we are doing fourth quarter awards. And the reason that happens is because you got to know when you're going to have the money so that you can sign that contract. Because I don't have the authority to commit the government, the American taxpayer, to a bill without having the money in the bank. It's that simple. But again, from corporate America, many of you are aware that as you look at your timing, as you look at the numbers that you're supposed to meet for that quarter or for that year, that doesn't necessarily align with the days that I am able to get to a contract. So a continuing resolution has a significant impact on us, but quite frankly, I would argue that if you ask any of the officers here in the room, our expectation is that we will always have a continuing resolution. And that I'm not going to get my money, we're not going to get our money until later on in the calendar year, which causes us to scramble. I believe that will happen again, and quite frankly, as an Army, I think we've gotten really good at making sure that we prepare ourselves for a continuing resolution. Where it impacts us is as you kind of go back down that taxonomy where I talked about our investments and our decisions. So the problem for us is those things that would be considered new start programs don't happen. And that pushes that time to get to a system. And so I think it's going to be an impact. It gets to this notion that if you want to fix the acquisition process, you've got to take this kind of whole of government approach that includes how we budget for innovation, how we budget for modernization. And I believe that a one-year appropriation for how we do this is the wrong way to do business. So the second, I'm sorry, let me just answer really quickly. So this notion of the Rapid Capability Office so we are maturing that, but our intent, going back to the previous question, our intent is how can we reduce the cycle time from a good idea that has been validated as a need by our warfighters and then prioritized by the chief and the Secretary of the Army that allows us to focus our activity and get that capability out soon. I'm very excited about what I believe the Rapid Capability Office can provide. We spent a lot of time learning from the Air Force and their implementation. We are going to tweak the way they've done it, and I think it's going to add great value to our acquisition processes.
Hey, sir, Roy Perkins from BAE Systems. A few weeks ago down at the TRADOC Professional Forum, your question came up on a panel that was led by General Dias. There was a lot of discussion that went round and round about how the Army could move forward. But the one thing that kind of came out of that panel discussion was that the PMs no longer have the same amount of flexibility they used to have in spending some of their money. For example, we made Bradley, so I use Bradley as an example. Incremental upgrades to Bradley now are packaged into large ACAT ECP programs. So there was a recommendation that went in front of the panel that they couldn't answer, which was, you know, when I was still wearing a uniform in G8, there was a modded service line for most programs,
Right.
where the PM then had the flexibility to adjust his modded services. Is that an option that's open now that you could restart?
You know, so I think that's a great example of how can you create some agility, but again, I'm really uncomfortable with any discussion that says, here's a good idea without a way to fund it. And so as budgets have gotten tighter, as our flexibility has gone down because of our requirements to cover so many different things, we've lost that agility. But let me give you an example of where we think, as we looked at modernization within combat vehicles and prototyping, one of the things that we wanted to do was include a line. The number's not important, but I'll just say somewhere in the $25 million mark. That gave us the ability to go out to look at components within, so whether it's powertrain, whether it's the kinetic part, the weapon piece, or even entire vehicles. It would give us some flexibility, unencumbered to a particular program, but within the vehicle portfolio. And even though there is this legislation that talks about go faster, smarter, be more innovative, when I look at the marks, I see that that's a line that got hit really hard, to the point of being zeroed out. And so the narrative has to be matched by the dollars to allow us to do what you've just described.
Well, thank you very much, sir. How about a hand for that?